Welcome, geniuses. I'm Genie, your best buddy for A-levels. In this channel, we'll bring you to explore the secret formula behind success.
This question is a A2 question on topic 13, photosynthesis. This is asking about how do you relate the absorption spectrum related to an action spectrum. So first, let's define what is an absorption spectrum and what is an action spectrum. Absorption spectrum is actually a graph that shows wavelength absorbed by the pigments. Whereas action spectrum is showing the wavelength used for photosynthesis. So if you are answering question on absorption spectrum, you can only talk about what are the wavelength that is absorbed by the pigments, and when you're answering about action spectrum, only you can mention about rate of photosynthesis. So let's look at what are the wavelengths that are being absorbed. So you need to understand that between 400 to 500 is actually representing blue wavelength. So although we know the whole spectrum is 7 color, but we just focus on 3 main colors, which is 400 to 500 is blue, 500 to 600 will be green, and 600 to 700 will represent red. So if you look at the absorption spectrum, which is on the right hand axis, this one, and represented by the dotted line, you'll realize that majority of the pigments are absorbing between 400 to 500 and 600 to 700. So what does it indicate? So it indicates that most of the photosynthetic pigments prefer to absorb blue wavelength and red wavelength. And from this graph, it shows that none of this pigment is actually absorbing between 500 to 600, which is the green wavelength. Therefore, your pigments are generally seen as green because they don't absorb green, but instead the green is being reflected. As for the action spectrum, do you see any resemblance between the peak for the absorption spectrum and the action spectrum? You realize that action spectrum, we're going to refer to the left hand side of the axis, where you will see that the peak is actually also around 400 to 500 and between 600 to 700. So this shows that photosynthetic pigments are actually absorbing more of the blue wavelength and the red wavelength for photosynthesis. But if you're observant, you realize that why is it that in between, you can see that there's not much of green wavelength being absorbed, but why is it that the rate of photosynthesis is still relatively higher? This is because we have more than one type of pigments. Other than chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B that is stated here, we do have other accessory pigments such as carotenoids, xanthophyll, that absorbs wavelength between 500 to 600. So for this question, what does the question actually want? The question is asking why the peak X for the action spectrum, so pay attention, is referring to the action spectrum, is higher than peak Y. So they're actually asking why this X is higher than the Y. In another word, do you know that the X and Y is representing rate of photosynthesis? So the rate of photosynthesis So you reinterpret the question as in photosynthesis rate. So we're going to comment that rate of photosynthesis at X is higher than Y as more light energy. Take note, it's always about the energy. When the wavelength hits the plant, the pigment, what they absorb is actually the energy, not just the light. As more light energy is absorbed, how can you tell? You look at the pig, you see more percentage of light is actually being absorbed. And from the graph, you can actually see that there are actually more blue wavelength that's being absorbed compared to the red wavelength. And based on your understanding about the length of wavelength and the energy, we will know that blue wavelength is shorter. Therefore, it has a greater energy. So if you relate to photosynthesis, what is this energy for? This energy is used to excite the electrons, which is going to contribute to ATP formation. So you're going to increase your rate of light-dependent reaction. Hope this question reinforces your understanding on the difference between the absorption and action spectrum and how they are correlated. Thank you.
That's all for today's video. If you're interested in more genuine sharing by other geniuses, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on the notification bell, ding dong. Also, if you're struggling with one or two past year questions and the mark scheme just doesn't seem to help, Genie has got you covered. Feel free to let us know what question it is by filling in the Google form linked in the description below. GenieUs Hub will get genius teachers to fulfill your request for the solution. Genie will see you next time. Bye-bye.